Yesterday, the Holy Father met with representatives of the Eastern Rite Catholic Churches, and he said something that caused quite the stir online among traditionalists and traditionally minded Catholics. And that's the incredible thing here, because some have suggested this gives insight onto what we can expect his attitude towards the liturgy will be, and especially the traditional Latin Mass. It has been noted that if Summorum Pontificum hadn't been undone by Francis by now, most of the liturgy debates would be simply that, debates on how reverent should the liturgy be, should you give the traditional mass a try if you aren't used to it, and all that stuff. But Francis really lit things on fire with Traditionis Custodes. And many have speculated that he will undo Traditionis Custodes. We shall see. But let's go first to this news announcement, because we now have an idea of what the Pope is going to do when it comes to actually not the Eastern Rites, but the Eastern Orthodox. Let's start there. From the Orthodox Times, headline, Pope Leo confirms the meeting with Ecumenical Patriarch in Nicaea is in preparation. If you're not aware, Francis was actually going to meet with the East, and it was going to be for the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And one of the things that was going to be discussed was, and I hope this is not on the agenda anymore because this is a terrible idea, but it's somehow artificially altering the Catholic Church's liturgical calendar to always have Easter at the same time that the Eastern Orthodox do. You might think, well, why is that a terrible idea? Because there's a whole lot of deep theology about how the date of Easter is calculated. And part of the reason the Eastern Orthodox, or a major reason they have a different date for Easter and Christmas and everything else, is because in the West we use the Gregorian calendar and they don't. Needless to say, it would cause chaos. It would cause a mess. And this is the kind of ecumenical dialogue that generally most hardline traditionalists are fine with, because the entire point of it is to get back to East-West reunification. But it can't be done by sacrificing truth. Let's go to the details of this. I thought I turned off all the ads, but it looks like they're starting to pop back on, because of course they are. From the article, quote, Pope Leo XIV confirmed today, that would have been a couple days ago, that a meeting with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is currently being organized during his first formal encounter with the press. The meeting with the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew will take place. We are preparing it, the newly elected pontiff stated, referring to a long-anticipated gathering initially planned between Patriarch Bartholomew and the late Pope Francis. The meeting was scheduled to take place on May 26th in Nicaea, Asia Minor, to mark the 1700th anniversary of the First Ecumenical Council, a pivotal event in the history of Christianity. While Pope Leo XIV did not clarify whether the date will remain unchanged or be slightly postponed for logistical reasons, preparations are clearly underway. In the meantime, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew is expected to arrive in Rome on Saturday, May 18th, to attend the enthronement ceremony of the new Roman pontiff and to hold a private meeting with him. End quote. So that is going to happen on Saturday. Be vigilant and watch as it happens, and I will happily report on it here for you in the aftermath. Which reminds me, if you like news videos where we don't actually sugarcoat things and we're just brutally honest, go ahead and hit subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Now, not be confused with the Eastern Orthodox. The Holy Father met with representatives of the Eastern Rite Catholic Churches. These are Catholic churches in full communion, in absolute communion with Rome. They have ancient liturgies that have been largely untouched by the people attempting to revise everything. And the liturgy here is important for his address. I'm just going to read to you his address to them. It's incredible in some places. Dear brothers and sisters, Christ is risen. He is truly risen. I greet you in these words that Eastern Christians in many lands never tire of repeating during the Easter season, as they profess the very heart of our faith and hope. It is very moving for me to see you here during the Jubilee of Hope, a hope unshakably grounded in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Welcome to Rome. I'm happy to be with you and to devote one of the first audiences of my pontificate to the Eastern faithful. You are precious in God's eyes. Looking at you, I think of the diversity of your origins, your glorious history, and the bitter sufferings that many of your communities have endured or continue to endure. I would like to reaffirm the conviction of Pope Francis that the Eastern churches are to be cherished and esteemed for the unique spiritual and sapiential traditions that they preserve, and for all that they have to say to us about the Christian life, synodality, and the liturgy. We think of early fathers, the councils, and monasticism, inestimable treasures for the church, with a citation of Pope Francis speaking to the Eastern churches. I would like also to mention Pope Leo XIII, the first pope to devote a specific document to the dignity of your churches, inspired above all by the fact that, in his words, the work of human redemption began in the East. Truly, you have a unique and privileged role as the original setting where the church was born. It is significant that several of your liturgies, which you are now solemnly celebrating in Rome accordance with your various traditions, continue to use the language of the Lord Jesus. Indeed, Pope Leo XIII made a heartfelt appeal that the legitimate variety of Eastern liturgy and discipline may redound to the great honor and benefit of the Church. His desire remains ever timely. In our own day, too, many of our Eastern brothers and sisters, including some of you, have been forced to flee their homelands because of war and persecution, instability and poverty, and risk losing not only their native lands, but also, when they reach the West, their religious identity. As a result, with the passing of generations, the priceless heritage of the Eastern churches is being lost. Over a century ago, Leo XIII pointed out that, quote, preserving the Eastern rites is more important than is generally realized. He went so far as to decree that, quote, any Latin rite missionary, whether a member of the secular or religious clergy, who by advice or support draws any Eastern Rite Catholic to the Latin rite, ought to be dismissed and removed from his office. We willingly reiterate this appeal to preserve and promote the Christian East, especially in the diaspora. In addition to establishing Eastern circumscriptions, wherever possible and opportune, there is a need to promote greater awareness among Latin Christians. In this regard, I ask the Dicastery for the Eastern Churches, which I thank for its work, to help me to define principles, norms, and guidelines whereby Latin bishops can concretely support Eastern Catholics in the diaspora in their efforts to preserve their living traditions, and thus by distinctive witness to enrich the communities in which they live. The Church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. And then this is what everything people grabbed onto here. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies. Liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of the primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, and the value so typical of Eastern spirituality: constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. It is vital, then, that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them, for the sake perhaps of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. Your traditions of spirituality, ancient yet ever new, are medicinal. In them, the drama of human misery is combined with wonder at God's mercy, so that our sinfulness does not lead to despair, but opens us to accepting the gracious gift of becoming creatures who are healed, divinized, and raised to the heights of heaven. For this, we ought to give endless praise and thanks to the Lord. Together, we can pray with St. Ephrem the Syrian and say to the Lord Jesus, "Glory to you who laid your cross as a bridge over death. Glory to you who clothed yourself in the body of mortal man and made it the source of life for all mortals." We must ask, then, for the grace to see the certainty of Easter in every trial of life, and not to lose heart, remembering, as another great Eastern father wrote, that the greatest sin is not to believe in the power of the resurrection. Who better than you can sing a song of hope even amid the abyss of violence? Who better than you, who have experienced the horrors of war so closely that Pope Francis referred to you as martyr churches? From the Holy Land to the country in the Eastern Europe that you can't say the name of on YouTube without getting in trouble, apparently. From Lebanon to Syria, from the Middle East to Tigray and Caucasus. How much violence do we see? Rising up from this horror, from the slaughter of the most young, what ought to which ought to provoke outrage because lives are being sacrificed in the name of military conquest, there resounds an appeal. The appeal not so much of the Pope, but of Christ himself, who repeats, "Peace be with you." And he adds, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you. I do not give it to you as the world gives it." Christ's peace is not the sepulchral silence that reigns after conflict. It is not the fruit of oppression, but rather a gift that is meant for all, a gift that brings new life. Let us pray for this peace, which is reconciliation, forgiveness, and the courage to turn the page and start anew. For my part, I will make every effort so that this peace may prevail. The Holy See is always ready to help bring enemies together, face to face, to talk to one another, so that peoples everywhere may once more find hope and recover the dignity they deserve, the dignity of peace. The peoples of our world desire peace, and to their leaders I appeal with all my heart. Let us meet, let us talk, let us negotiate. War is never inevitable. Weapons can and must be silenced, for they do not resolve problems but only increase them. Those who make history are the peacemakers, not those who sow seeds of suffering. Our neighbors are not our first enemies, but our fellow human beings, not criminals to be hated, but other men and women with whom we can speak. Let us reject a Manichaean notion so typical of that mindset of violence that divides the world into those who are good and those who are evil. The Church will never tire of repeating, "Let weapons be silenced." I would like to thank God for all those who in silence, prayer, and self-sacrifice are sowing seeds of peace. I thank God for those Christians, Eastern and Latin alike, who above all in the Middle East persevere and remain in their homelands, resisting the temptation to abandon them. Christians must be given the opportunity, not just in words, to remain in their native lands with all the rights needed for a secure existence. Please let us strive for this. Thank you, dear brothers and sisters of the East, the lands where Jesus, the Son of Justice, dawned, for being lights in our world. Continue to be outstanding for your faith, hope, and charity, and nothing else. May our churches be exemplary, and may our pastors promote communion with integrity, especially in the Synod of Bishops, that they may be places of fraternity and authentic co-responsibility. Ensure transparency in the administration of goods and be signs of humble and complete dedication to the holy people of God, without regard for honors, worldly power, or appearance. Saint Simeon, the new theologian, used an eloquent image in this regard. Just as one who throws dust on the flame of a burning furnace extinguishes it, so the cares of this life and every kind of attachment to petty and worthless things destroys the warmth of the heart that was initially kindled. Today, more than ever, the splendor of the Christian East demands freedom from all worldly attachments and from every tendency contrary to communion in order to remain faithful in obedience and in evangelical witness. I thank you for this, and in cordially giving you my blessing, I ask you to pray for the Church and raise your powerful prayers of intercession for my ministry. Thank you. Well, with the words of His Holiness Pope Leo XIV to the Eastern Churches. And you can see why people kind of grabbed onto that when it comes to the liturgy and questions about the liturgy, because there are many questions we have right now. And one of the questions is, what will happen with the traditional Mass? Because that is virtually nobody is happy with the status quo, except for those who have almost a diabolical hatred of it. And I'm not the only one to notice this. Damian Thompson, who runs the Holy Smoke podcast, as well as other things, says, of course, the quickest way to restore a sense of mystery of the Western Church is to lift the sadistic Francis Roche restrictions on the traditional rite. Note the liberal hacks were careful not to tweet out this passage, and he's correct there. And note that he says is to lift the restrictions. He's not saying the full restoration is the primary rite of the Latin West. Just lift the restrictions on it. Summorum Pontificum was never actually fully implemented. Many bishops resisted it. You were supposed to be able to have the traditional Mass at your parish if there was enough people in your parish who wanted it, but many bishops wouldn't allow it to happen. In the same way that when Benedict XVI issued a revision to the Novus Ordo, trying to attempt to end all debates on the validity of the consecration in the Novus Ordo, because that was a debate for a long time. Theologians were raising red flags that some of the consecratory prayers were a complete and total break from all of the theological tradition of the Church, and to the point where people wondered, at least theologians did, whether it was valid or not. So Benedict XVI fixed it. And there were bishops' conferences who ignored him. That's kind of the elephant in the room here. Will they ignore Leo XIV if he does intervene. Now, Cardinal Muller did chime in after this. Rorate Caeli gives us a good section of this interview with the headline, Cardinal Muller to the Associated Press on the Latin Mass and the new Pope. According to his character, I think he is able to speak with people and to find a very good solution that is good for everybody. He was, again, I'm amazed that the Associated Press would go out to talk to him. And you're going to see some things in this section here that they pulled from this longer interview where it's pretty clear that the Associated Press has no idea what they're talking about when it comes to the Mass. The Mass before Vatican II was not the same Mass you see in your typical parish, except in Latin before Vatican II and now in whatever the local language is after. The differences are astonishing, complete, like a fundamental transformation of the liturgy. And if you read the document Sacrosanctum Concilium of Vatican II, it's pretty clear that they didn't call for a new liturgy at the council. They called for a few minor adjustments to the liturgy, including a few parts of it being said in the vernacular, the normal Latin, the normal local language, but not the whole thing. And yet they use it as an excuse to give you a new liturgy. And that new liturgy doesn't even follow the rules set forth for the liturgy in the documents of Vatican II. And this is going to be a challenge for a pope who, at some point, to try to fix things, because His Holiness said that we need to restore the sacredness and the mystery and the wonder of the liturgy. In plain language, the liturgy is supposed to be reverent. You're supposed to actually, the priest is supposed to treat the liturgy, the Mass, as if he actually believes that what he is doing is confecting a miracle on the altar of transubstantiation. In all too many parishes, you see that they don't act like they believe it. It's a loss of the sense of wonder and the sense of mystery and the sense of the sacred. This goes beyond, a lot of the questions of the TLM versus Novus Ordo. There are reverent Novus Ordo masses. Now, you can get into hot water in traditionalist circles by endorsing them. I just want to see, personally, the Mass treated as if the priest who is offering the Mass and the laity attending actually believe what it is that we Catholics profess to believe when we go to Mass. It's a good start. Here's the section here Rorate Caeli highlights. Quote, they, the cardinals, went to last week's conclave vastly outnumbered, meaning the conservative ones, and smarting after being sidelined by Pope Francis for 12 years. And yet conservatives and traditionalist Catholics are cautiously optimistic over the historic election of Pope Leo XIV, hopeful that he will return doctrinal vigor to the papacy. Even as progressive sense, he will continue Francis's reformist agenda. Cardinal Gerhard Muller, a titan of the conservative bloc, said Monday he was very pleased with the election and expected that Leo would heal the divisions that escalated during Francis's pontificate. Muller, who was fired by Francis as the Vatican's doctrinal chief, suggested as a first step that Leo should restore access to the old Latin Mass that his predecessor had greatly restricted. I am convinced that he will overcome these superfluous tensions which were damaging for the Church, Muller said in an interview with the Associated Press. We cannot avoid all the conflicts, but we have to avoid the not necessary conflicts, the superfluous conflicts. I think it was a good impression of him to everybody, and in the end it was a great concordia, a great harmony, Muller said. There was no polemics, no fractionizing. Speaking in an interview in his apartment library just off St. Peter's Square, Muller said Francis's crackdown on traditionalists in the Old Mass created unnecessary divisions that Leo knows he must heal. Pope Benedict XVI had loosened restrictions on celebrations of the traditional Latin Mass, which was used for centuries before modernizing reforms of the 1960 Second Vatican Council, which allowed the liturgy to be celebrated in the vernacular. There's a lot more difference than that. This is where they don't know what they're talking about. Well, yeah, interject here. The Latin Mass was not used for, quote, centuries before the modernizing reforms of the 1960s. The Latin Mass in the West developed organically from apostolic times in the West, with some adjustments over time. It wasn't born when Pius V passed quo primum. He banned new versions of the Mass from being promulgated and made the rite most common in Rome the rite used throughout the West. That's what he did, with some adjustments to it. And for centuries afterwards, popes would be asked, "Hey, why isn't Saint Joseph mentioned in the Mass?" And he said, "Well, I don't have the power. I'm just the Pope. I don't have the power to adjust the Mass." You'd see that. I think it was Leo XIII said that, actually. there's a lot more to the liturgical wars than that. But here's what he finally says. He says, we cannot absolutely condemn or forbid the legitimate rite and form of the Latin liturgy, Muller said. According to his character, I think Leo is able to speak with people and to find a very good solution that is good for everybody. End quote. Now, would not take that to mean that Muller thinks you're going to see the traditional Mass unleashed completely. Note he's not calling for the restoration of the TLM as the sole form of the Latin or a sole form of the Mass for the Latin West. That's not what he's calling for. What he's calling for is it to be just available. We might be lucky to get Summorum Pontificum reestablished. Probably somewhere between Summorum Pontificum and Traditionis Custodes is my suspicion. Now, that wasn't the only thing that the Holy Father spoke about, though. It wasn't just the Eastern rites, which then spawned this whole conversation about the Mass. We can go here to something from philstar.com. Headline, Pope Leo XIV says church in great need of priests and nuns. And obviously that seems like a very obvious observation. There has been no boom in vocations in a very long time. And if you look over the last 60 years, vocations to the priesthood and to the religious life fell off a cliff after Vatican II. The life of the typical Catholic is vastly different simply by the virtue of there being fewer priests and fewer religious. And he kind of makes a passing reference here to a lot of this and says that reminds us of how important they are. And I mentioned this because longtime viewers will be aware that I've been following the story of bishops canceling conservative and traditionally minded religious orders, specifically of nuns most of the time, often for some pretty nefarious purposes. Some bishops just nakedly going after their property. And I made a video for what the new pope would have to do. One of the things he has to do is address the religious question, the religious life question, nuns and monks and what's happening to them at the hands of their local bishops. Often these nuns being accused of monstrous things that under scrutiny fall apart. Happened down in Arlington, Texas. It's a whole complicated story down there. They got accused of such evil things, and all of the things he got accused of all fell apart under scrutiny. But there's like a concerted effort to take down nuns, and you have to be a pretty wicked person to go after nuns. You really do. Here's what he talked about. Quote, Pope Leo XIV championed religious life yesterday in a public address, saying the church has a great need for its priests and nuns, while young people require credible models. Today, brothers and sisters, I therefore have the joy of praying with you and all the people of God for vocations, especially those to the priesthood and consecrated life, the American Pope said. The church has such a great need for them, added the Pope, who was elected last Thursday, adding that young people needed to be able to look up credible models of generous dedication to God. End quote. I know that seems like a very light, trite observation to some people, but there is a side of things where this is becomes a role model issue for people. They do serve as a living witness of people dedicating their entire existence to God. Whether they're cloistered nuns or nuns who spend time out in the world doing the corporal works of mercy as a primary focus, and same with monks, they spend a lot of time in prayer, praying for people. You see a reference to this in Chesterton's famous poem, Lepanto. I recommend reading that sometime. Or I think it's Christopher Check, I think his name is. He's a historian who does like a performance of it for Lighthouse Catholic Media. If you can find a copy of that, it's magnificent. And Chesterton acknowledges in there the role of religious in like the material wars between Catholicism and some of the so-called peaceful alternatives out there from the Holy Land, and the role the religious play in this. Magnificent poem, and it really does illustrate how we are in a war with princes and principalities, and the religious as prayer warriors are central to that battle. A question that I've seen asked a little bit, but not widely by any commentator, has addressed this, and is an interesting question involving Leo XIV and his American citizenship status. It's a question, I think, that is interesting. I kind of knew the answer to this already, but I was happy to see it get addressed in formal Catholic media. Does Leo XIV, the Holy Father, have to renounce his U.S. citizenship to be the monarch of a foreign country? The Vatican City State is a country, it's a nation state. The Pope is the absolute monarch of the Vatican City. He is the head of state of Vatican City State. It's usually frowned upon for Americans to take government jobs for other governments, and there's a whole lot of laws that govern this. And now, for Catholics, we don't really think too much about this, but there are Protestants who, you may have seen some of the anti-Catholic Protestant propaganda out there that talk about how, the Pope is going to control the U.S. and all this other stuff. This goes back centuries in our history. And I've seen a resurgence of that. And so it did kind of bring to mind that question. And I kind of knew the answer, and that answer was no, he doesn't have to rescind his citizenship. But there's reasons for that, and I do think it's an interesting question. So let's go here to Vatican News. I believe this is Vatican, no, Catholic News Agency, sorry. With the headline, Pope Leo XIV's American citizenship. Can he keep it as Pope? And the short answer is yes, he can. But there are still questions about that for some people. Because when you're the head of state of a foreign country, but you're an American citizen, you start running into questions about taxes and voting and residency and all these other things. And there are certain levels, to certain points where he would have to renounce his citizenship. But it's not so cut and dry as many observers would think. And I'm happy that the answer for him is not yes, that he has to renounce it. Although if he did, being Pope is more important than his citizenship, obviously. So from the article, quote, Catholics around the world continue to celebrate the election last week of Pope Leo XIV, the first Pope from the United States. In addition to being a natural-born American citizen, Leo is also a naturalized citizen of Peru, having ministered there for decades. His election as Pope raises several interesting questions from a nationality law perspective. Chiefly, can a U.S. citizen become king of a foreign country and still remain an American citizen? The Pope is, after all, an absolute monarch. He possesses, as the Vatican's fundamental law explains, quote, the fullness of the power of government, which includes the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of the Vatican City State, a sovereign country that maintains relations with over 175 other nations, and the Holy See, which is the central governing authority of the Church. Paul Hunker, an American immigration attorney and a Catholic, told the Catholic News Agency that U.S. federal law, specifically 8 U.S. Code subsection 1481, spells out some very specific conditions under which a U.S. citizen can lose his or her citizenship. These include committing acts of treason, obtaining naturalization in a foreign state, and crucially, accepting a position as a foreign head of state. The key, though, is that in order to be expatriating, these things must be done by a person voluntarily and with the intention of relinquishing their U.S. nationality. The U.S. State Department says it generally presumes that U.S. citizens, even if they accept a foreign government post, want to keep their citizenship unless clearly and credibly established otherwise. Hunker said in the Pope's case, Leo would likely need to affirm an intention to renounce his citizenship directly to a consular officer at the U.S. Embassy in Rome, something Leo has not signaled any intention to do. I think unless he comes forward and says, I have the intention of relinquishing my U.S. nationality, then he's not considered to have lost his U.S. citizenship, Hunker said. At a deep level, I think it says something great about our country. When you're born here, the government can't kick you out unless you affirmatively say that you're renouncing your citizenship. However, the State Department does go on to say that it may, quote, actively review cases in which a U.S. national is elected or otherwise appointed to serve as a foreign head of state, foreign head of government, or foreign minister, as such cases raise complex questions of international law, including issues related to the level of immunity from U.S. jurisdiction that the person so serving may be afforded. End quote. We'll come back to this in a moment. You can see where the law there could be used against the Pope. Now, I'm not saying it's going to, not under the current administration. But imagine you get a more traditionally American anti-Catholic administration next. The kind of administration is going to start reopening old wounds related to the McCarrick kind of priest problem out of Boston from 2003. Morally unfit men to be for the priesthood who were brought into the priesthood in large numbers, and lo and behold, many of them did evil, wicked, unspeakable things to the most young and vulnerable. You could see a scenario where in a retaliatory sense, or maybe an opportunistic sense. Because again, we're talking about potentially an anti-Catholic administration in the future, where they would go after the Holy Father and basically remove his citizenship. You know, now, granted, that would cause a firestorm of controversy, but that could be taken advantage of, or they could take advantage of any kind of controversy that's ongoing. If this question had happened 20 years ago, you might have seen it. The U.S. media was like stridently anti-Catholic in 2003, 2004, 2005, during the height of the McCarrick kind of problem. And there are questions about the former Cardinal Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV's own history of handling these things. I don't bring it up much because I know the Vatican is going to address it, and then we'll wait and see what happens when they do. But there are questions there. And if not handled right, it could, crack the door open for something. I'm not saying they're going to take a citizenship from him, at least not this administration. Let's go back and get a few more details, though, because this is an interesting area of interesting subject. Quote, whatever ultimately transpires regarding Leo's U.S. citizenship, Pope Leo will potentially have to continue filing a tax return with the IRS as an American citizen living abroad. Can you imagine being the IRS agent who handles the Pope's taxes? Another potentially complex oddity that is uncharted territory, since Poland, Germany, Argentina, the homelands of the last three popes, don't tax their citizens abroad. It might require a private letter from the IRS or a specific law from Congress addressing Leo's situation, the Washington Post reported. But what about his Peruvian citizenship? Under the Peruvian constitution, Peruvian nationality, even obtained through naturalization, is not lost except by express renunciation before a Peruvian authority. Thus, the status of Leo's Peruvian citizenship is similar to that of his U.S. citizenship. He'll likely keep it unless he specifically chooses to renounce it. So now that he's the Pope, does Leo also have Vatican citizenship? Yes and no. Andrea Gargladucci, a Vatican analyst for Catholic News Agency, said Leo would already have had a Vatican passport, as every cardinal and curial official is given one as part of their office. Possessing the passport gives them what is known as functional citizenship. However, he noted that under canon law, it's not really accurate to say that the Pope is a citizen of the Holy See, because the Holy See and the Pope are one and the same. The Pope is not a citizen, he is the whole Holy See, Gagliarducci explained. The Pope does not need a passport nor a citizenship, because he is the source of every citizenship. Given Leo's broad new temporal powers as Pope, there would appear to be no reason he couldn't maintain his other citizenships if he wanted to. There's even precedent for this, as in 2014, Pope Francis renewed his Argentine passport, though Francis never returned there during his 12-year pontificate. For his part, Gagliarducci said Francis's maintenance of his Argentinian citizenship was simply not necessary. I mean, there is no harm in keeping the passports, but they are no longer needed and useful. The Vatican gives you a passport and lets you retain all of your citizenship along with that passport, he said. But you cannot consider the Pope a Peruvian, a U.S. citizen, or whatever. He is the Holy See. This is different. It is another world. And I think that's the part where a lot of Catholics, and American Catholics especially, will have a hard time wrapping their head around. The Holy Father is the Holy See. I know that's hard for us to imagine, hard to wrap our heads around, because we don't think of President Trump as the United States of America. Whatever else, even if you are his biggest supporter, you don't think of him as the United States of America. But Pope Leo XIV is essentially the Holy See for all intents and purposes. That's why he doesn't need it. He doesn't need a passport. I mean, he is the head of a state. They're not going to check him in at customs and make sure that everything is above board. He will be traveling as a state official, at the top state official, receiving all the customary honors and welcomes that go with that. But the question I have is, will we see the Holy Father travel to the U.S. November next year to vote in the midterm elections? Probably not. He'll probably go, if he's going to, he'll go into the consulate in Rome to do that. If you're a citizen traveling abroad, you can do that. But there are other questions, too, related to a lot of that. And I do want to touch the political implications in the future, because there are some that should be noted and viewed as dispassionately as possible. Because as Catholics, we're not supposed to have partisan loyalties that overshadow our faith loyalties. There's going to be a conflict there. And Catholic social teaching becomes kind of the important crux for understanding these things with. The Evictus says the Pope is the crown. Yes, Okay, Peeps says it's like Queen Elizabeth not having a driver's license. Those licenses are from her name. Right. Monarchy is a completely different beast than America's representative democracy. Timmy Keller says the SSPX is in a very good position to be of help to Leo concerning reestablishing the mystery of the Master directly under the authority of the Pope. I think so if things are handled appropriately. There have been, suggestions that he's going to meet with the SSPX representative at some point in the near future, whisperings of that happening. And it would not surprise me if he met with the head of Opus Dei yesterday, or maybe this morning, and had a positive meeting with him. Opus Dei has wanted a bishop for a long time. I would not be surprised if a traditionally minded cardinal or bishop was appointed to a position in the Holy See to be the bishop who oversees Opus Dei, FSSP, Institute of Christ the King, as well as the SSPX. Whether that bishop then authorizes more bishops to deal with their day-to-day needs or whatever, don't be surprised if something like that happens. Leo XIV has said himself that he was appointed, made Pope, elected by his peers, his former peers, to heal the divisions in the church. This will be something that he will absolutely have to address at some point. I can't speak slower, Esdras. It's a generational thing. When I speak slower, I get accused of droning. Anyway, with that, we'll wrap this up. I'm just curious what you think about all this in the comments. There is the debates about the liturgy are central to the questions of unity in the church. They were the source, or at least they were kind of the central part of the debates. But there is more to the divide in the church than the liturgy. A lot of it is ecumenical dialogue. There was a letter issued by Pope Leo to those who follow the philosophy of the guy that they make in the East, of the fat guy without a shirt on in the East, that make little idols out of. And he said some very positive things about them, and that was shocking to the conscience of many Catholics. That happened in the last couple of days. I haven't really commented on it much because it's nothing new. Every one of his predecessors going back to 1958 has done it too. But there's a great divide in the church, and the way to heal it, part of it is the liturgy, but it's also more than the liturgy. It's standing up for the truth of the faith. And when ultimately that is something that we have to watch and wait and see with what happens. Zachariel says, often he doesn't understand how people think I'm speaking too fast. He says, I watch videos often at 1.5 speed to get the info faster. Yeah, that is, when I talk about a great divide on the internet. Some people, younger content creators, speak too fast. Others watch younger content creators at 1.5 times speed to get through their videos faster. There are some health people, and I'll occasionally some health and fitness videos I'll watch by people younger than me, and they are speaking at 1 million miles a minute. Da, 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 da. It's just completely blows my mind. Philip does ask a question that occurred to me. He says, how much of the fat guy in the East was already in the works? Curia needs to be cleaned out. I think that document was already in the works. Probably during the interregnum, maybe even authorized by Francis. Ron says, I think we have bigger things to worry about than the post-passports and citizenship. It's an interesting question because it does also lend itself to future persecution attempts of the church. All right, folks. Thanks very much. Oh, Joe Blog says, if we quote Pope Leo about Christians being God's chosen people, will we be canceled for hate speech? I'm very curious how certain other Abrahamic religions are going to take that statement of his. Are they going to ignore it because he's a new pope and you just generally play nice at first? Or are they going to take umbrage with it? I'm curious, though, what you think about this. In the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It absolutely helps. Sharing this on social media helps too. Pray for the Holy Father. He will need your prayers in this time, and pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.